Hello and most welcome to 1774. Today we are going to make a new tryout since we're having connectivity problems. I will try to go through a chapter of Wittgenstein's methods, neglected aspects by Fischer. And we're looking closer into this, what book it is later on. I go for a read and I will do a short summary at the end. It will take about 1 hour. We'll see how it comes out. Give me a second there. So, Wittgenstein's method, neglected aspects by G.P. Baker. I said Fischer erroneously at the beginning, but it is by Baker, who is one of the most famed interpreter of Wittgenstein. And I will start at page 29. Philosophical Investigations, paragraph 122. Neglected aspects. A main source of our failure to understand is that we do not command a clear view of the use of our words. Our grammar is lacking in this sort of perspicuity. Übersichtlichkeit. A perspicuous representation produces just that sort of understanding, which consists in seeing connections. Hence the importance of finding and inventing intermediate cases. The concept of a perspicuous representation is of fundamental significance for us. It earmarks the form of account we give, the way we look at things. Is this a Weltanschauung? End of quote from Philosophical Investigations, paragraph 122. First impressions. This text is well known and often quoted. It seems to condense into one short remark much of Wittgenstein's distinctive conception of philosophy. it lodges a complaint about the grammar of our language, a lack of perspicuity, and it suggests that he took as a primary goal remedying this defect in our understanding by providing representations of grammar that would make things perspicuous. The search for perspicuity is a leitmotif of his later philosophy, clearly audible from the opening of philosophical remarks to the close of last writings. It must be an integral part of the philosopher's business of describing the actual use of language. Indeed, perspicuity might be taken to be the single ultimate end of all the activities of the philosopher, the goal to which the dissolution of all particular philosophical problems is subordinate. Though clearly important, Wittgenstein's concept of a perspicuous representation is not itself perspicuous. This is hardly surprising, since it is here introduced with minimal clarification and without a single example. Originally, he cited the color octahedron as a paradigm. He regarded this three-dimensional model or the corresponding two-dimensional diagram as a representation of the grammar of colors. From it, we can read off, for example, the possibility of a spectrum of shades between red and yellow, and the polar opposition of red and green. The entire grammar of the network of color words seems to be condensed into a diagram that can be taken in at a glance. Conversely, it seems as if this whole assemblage of rules can be reconstructed by close inspection of the diagram. Here, a sizable domain of grammar seems to be laid up or contained in a single sign. The power to condense something complex into a simple and manageable symbol seems to be the defining characteristic of what Wittgenstein called a perspicuous representation. Like the perspicuity, which is said to be essential to a proof in mathematics, the perspicuity of a representation is apparently to be explained by reference to its memorability and to the possibility of copying or reproducing it. Having inspected the diagram of the color octahedron once, most people can draw it again for themselves and make use of it to work out further relations among chromatic colors. The color octahedron is in fact the sole label instance of a perspicuous representation in all of Wittgenstein's published writings. This generates two major quandaries. First, how is the absence of anything closely comparable to the color octahedron from the text of the investigations compatible with the claim? The concept of a perspicuous representation is of fundamental importance to us. The reader might expect explicit applications of this concept to characterize Wittgenstein's philosophizing in the same way that Wright's criticism of the myth of the ghost in The Machine is punctuated by the pinpointing of category mistakes. Does the lack of diagrammatic representations of conceptual connections from the text prove that the remark on perspicuous representations is a fossil remnant of an extinct conception of philosophy? Should we argue that the term perspicuous representation covers a family of representations of the uses of symbols, and then go on to identify numerous unlabeled instances in the text? There's a prima facie tension in the investigations which any satisfactory interpretation of philosophical investigation, paragraph 122, must seek to resolve. The second quandary is the evident underdetermination of the grammar of the phrase a perspicuous representation by the general explanation given in paragraph 122. Even when this is supplemented by the example of the collar octahedron. In fact, there are two different directions in which these embryonic explanations of perspicuous representation could be expanded. The first conception lays stress on the concept of representation. It is our grammar, or the use of our words, which is said to lack perspicuity. Hence, presumably, it is a perspicuous representation of our grammar which is sought to remedy our failure to understand. This phraseology may be taken to indicate a contrast between our grammar and the representations of our grammar. The expectation of finding a contrast is fulfilled in Wittgenstein's characterization of the color octahedron as a perspicuous representation of the grammatical rules. Here, the purpose of the diagram seems to be producing an order within the motley collection of explanations of what red, green, yellow, etc. mean. Wittgenstein did not avow the intention of substituting the color octahedron in place of explanations of the combinatorial possibilities of color words, but rather the intention of using the diagram to make perspicuous this set of grammatical rules. We could even state the principle for projecting the diagram onto these grammatical rules, i.e., a method of representation. Consequently, there's a straightforward and important sense in which the color octahedron is a representation or even a picture of grammatical rules. If we follow this line of thought, we will conclude that what Wittgenstein called a perspicuous representation of grammatical rules must have the characteristic that the representation is distinct from what is represented. Neither identity nor permutation count as what we call a method of representation. In consequence, no verbal formulations of grammatical rules and no assemblage of grammatical rules can properly be called a perspicuous representation of grammatical rules, and conversely, the color octahedron cannot properly be viewed as a mere compendium of the combinatorial rules for color words. An advocate of this interpretation might summarize his conception in the claim that what Wittgenstein called a perspicuous representation, Darstellung, of grammatical rules is essentially different from a perspicuous arrangement, Zusammenstellung of grammatical rules. The second conception of a perspicuous representation is the polar opposite of the first. It seems to be the dominant interpretation offered by commentators who follow Wittgenstein in assigning a fundamental importance to the concept of a perspicuous representation in his practice of philosophizing. This second interpretation might be developed from the description of the color octahedron as a rough representation of color space, a grammatical representation, not a psychological one. Apparently, he meant to contrast the a priori relations among colors with relations that might be established by empirical investigation. This suggests that the role of the color octahedron is to describe color space by presenting the grammar of color words. But an enumeration of combinatorial rules for color words has exactly the same rule. Consequently, the diagram and the assemblage of combinatorial rules may each be called a grammatical representation of color space or a description of the use of color words. The diagram simply differs in virtue of being more comprehensive than any one rule or any succinct list of rules. The hallmark of what Wittgenstein called a perspicuous representation is that it is a presentation or arrangement of grammatical rules which can be taken in as a whole. An exponent of this second interpretation might epitomize his conception by claiming that a perspicuous representation is nothing more than a particular kind of arrangement of descriptions of the use of our words. This second interpretation might be reinforced by noting that somebody who knows us how to make use of the color octahedron can read off from it all of the combinatorial rules for chromatic colors. At the same time, this same thought seems to highlight the crucial difference between a diagrammatic representation of color space and a piecemeal description by enumeration of many rules. In the first case, this whole domain of grammar is depicted in a single survivable symbol, whereas in the second, the full description will be impossible to take in at a glance. It would perhaps be less misleading to claim that Wittgenstein intended the color ictrohedron to be a formulation of the grammar of our language than to claim that he meant it to represent or describe this grammar. Moreover, since he often called grammar itself a form of representation, this point perhaps explains why he called a perspicuous representation a form of representation. It must be seen as an element of grammar or as a member of the set of descriptions of our language. Just as an architect's blueprint is to be regarded as a description of a building. With this genus, perspicuous representations are differentiated by being survivable sets of rules which constitute complete explanations of how to use the words of our language. For the moment, we shall drop the first interpretation and explore the second one. By following up and elaborating its account of the role of the color octahedron, we do arrive at the conception of perspicuous representations, which has the merit of giving them a central place in Wittgenstein's account of the nature of philosophy. On this view, the general aim of the philosopher must be to produce surveyable descriptions of the uses of words which have a high degree of comprehensiveness and which can therefore be employed to clarify sizable domains of grammar and to dissolve many different philosophical problems all at once. What is required is the careful selection and arrangement of grammatical trivialities, that is, quiet weighing of linguistic facts. Settle paragraph 477 to bring out features of the uses of symbols of which we have lost sight in the welter of everyday explanations of what symbols mean. the philosopher reminds us of familiar facts which we have slipped out of our field of attention. And he directs our thinking into less convoluted paths by plotting a grammatical nexus, embracing a wide range of related concepts, primarily by producing schemata that avoid confusing detail. The production of perspicuous representations is the most general characterization of the proper goal of philosophy once we have come to acknowledge that philosophy can only describe the grammar of our language. The philosopher strives to command a clear view of the grammar of our language. His success is comparable to someone looking down on a city from a height, thereby commanding a clear view of the layout of its streets and squares. The philosopher has the additional task of giving a clear description of what his service. Here, his success is comparable to a cartographer's producing an aerial map. The analogy embedded in Wittgenstein's discourse about perspicuous representations is a bird's eye view of a city. In describing the grammar of our language, he is allegedly engaging logical geography a la Ryle, but he aimed to present his findings in a distinctive style of conceptual map. This second conception of the nature of perspicuous representations has several important corollaries. First, it suggests that Wittgenstein left room for a positive rule for philosophy, which stands in contrast and supplements its predominantly negative or therapeutic task. Though he treated particular problems like our illness and applied various particular therapies to make them disappear completely, his ideal of constructing perspicuous representations seems to indicate a striving towards a more systematic philosophy. Did he not envisage descriptions of some domains of grammar which would provide accurate maps and thereby constitute a permanent prophylaxis against whole sets of philosophical problems? For example, he seems to have aimed at a general classification of psychological concepts in which the correct treatment of each would throw light on all and thereby secure an understanding of conceptual connections that would dissolve many of the problems of philosophy of mind. Second, a perspicuous representation of grammar is evidently to be contrasted with the various mythologies of symbolism that philosophers are inclined to elaborate. This contrast might suggest that the aim is simply a correct description of the uses of words. The account books of language, which would explode various mistaken philosophical theories, ranging from Platonism, intuitionism in philosophy of mathematics, through Cartesian dualism and behaviorism in philosophy of mind, to logical atomism and the picture theory of the proposition of philosophy of logic. Wittgenstein often suggested that these theories can be traced to a more fundamental set of grammatical illusions, which are linked by the Augustine's conception of language. His intention was not to replace one mythology of symbolism by another parallel theory, not even to replace Augustine's picture by some alternative generalizations about the nature of language. Instead, he aimed at a survivable description of our grammar, which neutralizes the appeal of all standard philosophical theories. On his view, perspicuous representations are to stand on a different level. They make no pretensions to explain the uses of words. Hence, they abstain from metaphysical fantasies and stick to describing the down-to-earth, ordinary uses of our words. Their function is to destroy idols or to clear the ground of derelict structures and rubble, whereas Platonism and Cartesian dualism might be described as ways of seeing things. Indeed, as poor ways of seeing things which generate philosophical puzzles. A perspicuous representations does not ex officio embody any point of view. In this regard, it resembles a report of visual perception rather than a description of the visual aspects of things. Third, according to this interpretation, it is a pleonasm to say that the subject matter of a perspicuous representation is the grammar of our language or the use of our words. Nothing other than descriptions of grammar are even candidates for being called perspicuous representations. Consequently, there's no possibility of identifying any form of scientific theory, any hypothesis about any historical development or any observation about a religious ritual or a work of art as a perspicuous representation. In particular, it would be a mistake to call Goethe's scheme of plant morphology or Darwin's evolutionary scheme for the classification of species perspicuous representations, at least in the context of clarifying the employment of this expression in Wittgenstein's method of philosophizing. From this sketch of the bird's eye view model, we can milk out an account of the use of perspicuous representation in Wittgenstein's writings. It's rather longish here. Let me just put a point there. Let's see here how we can do it. So a very short summary in this first tryout is that when we're looking for a perspicuous picture, we are not looking, and I think that was very aptly put at the end, we are not looking for a Darwinian evolutionary scheme or Goethe's scheme of plant morphology, or more close to the trick, Linnaeus plant orthography or development of plants that is within his system. No, a perspicuous representation is the ordering and arrangement of the grammatical truths of the language. It's not an explanation, as we mentioned before, as much as a description. I think a description could be a much more apt word. A clearer and understandable way of approaching it. The color octahedron is what sort of gives the grammatical roots, but we must also remember it has a double edge to it. It is not soft. And it is only, as we know, labeled instance of perspicuous representation in all of his published works. But we must understand, as Baker is writing, that there would be a whole family of representation. There is no generalizable way of looking at representation and say that they're all identical, or they are in some way sharing traits. I would say that is absolutely impossible. They are all different as such. And therefore, there are several unlabeled instances of representations. This is the starting point of the question posed by G.P. Baker, and there's also where we will start slowly to get closer and deeper into this sort of thinking, of this understanding. And we will be more able to go deeper into the understanding as we realize that representation is the grammar or the use of our words. So a perspicuous representation could help to resolve the problem of not having this clarity of grammar. And I end this little tryout here. I hope it worked fine. Do apologize beforehand for any happenstances. Do have a very pleasant morning, afternoon, or night, wherever you are. Bye-bye for now.